Welcome to this episode of Abide in Me, How Jesus Models Secure Attachment with God. This series is a survey of the Gospel of Mark, looking for how Jesus models what is now called secure attachment, which is the physiological, emotional, cognitive, and spiritual experience of what is often called salvation or regeneration or being conjoined with God or enlightenment, individuation, even becoming spiritual. Through the series, we will discover the benefits of becoming securely attached with God, which is the transformation of one's life into one of joy and satisfaction. We continue our survey of Mark chapter 2, and we find Jesus beginning a regular practice of violating cultural norms. He sits down with a group of men that included people who did not as strictly adhere to the religious law, and so were labeled sinners, a derogatory term that now includes a moral and spiritual judgment, but in that culture simply meant that they were not permitted in the synagogue, they were not to be had dinner with. It's interesting, at the very end of his ministry, Jesus again sat at a table with a group of men, and it included a man who would later betray him, another man who would later deny knowing him, and a man who would not believe in him without physical proof of his reality. And yet we know that moment, the Last Supper, to be one of the most precious and holy times in all of Jesus' ministry, when he sat down with his apostles then. Well, these stories from Christian scriptures, similarly to other traditions stories, illustrate not simply Jesus' tolerance, but his complete acceptance of anyone who came to him seeking to follow him, as he said, to learn the truth and love. Jesus is modeling what we now acknowledge to be an emotional and spiritual bond, a secure attachment with God, that in fact we are all created to experience, that connection with God, with ourselves, and with other people. By 30 years old, which is young for us to be able to do, he had developed such a clear sense of himself and his value and his worth and his role in God's creation, a sense that he experienced as a gift from his Creator, that he was never swayed by other people's opinions. He was not afraid of their rejection. He was never deterred from caring for his children, indeed, because we are all God's children. The judgmental people around Jesus called attention to the pasts of these people, the reputation of the people sitting with Jesus, and they labeled them sinners. And by so doing, they separated those people from us human beings, right? Casting those people into a lower caste. These opinion makers, the teachers of the law among the people, were in fact afraid of losing their power, which depended on this separation from sinners, of losing their status, of being able to eat in fine places and be in the good seats in the synagogue, of not being seen as the most right and the most righteous, if those people, those sinners, are allowed to sit at their table. So Jesus was directly challenging them in their opinion of themselves and pointing out their fear and pointing out their place in the theocracy where they ruled. Jesus never says that he's all right with a person continuing to separate themselves from God, to not follow God, to become what we still call a sinner. Jesus offers a new view, however, and that is that such people are spiritually sick. When we are feeling separated from God, when we are following unhealthy, unhelpful, self-serving emotions, when we are believing falsities, Jesus is saying that we are in need of a physician, a spiritual physician. Right here, the very beginning of his public ministry, in only the second chapter of the Gospel of Mark, he engages with a man, Levi, who would later be called Matthew. And Levi was a man who had been given approval, been given the right by the Roman overseers to act out what might have been his greed. in collecting tribute money for the Romans from the Jews. And his job was to collect as much money as he could, and then sending on to the Romans only what the Romans required, what they actually asked for. And so, therefore, if Levi could get more money from the people he was collecting from than he had to pass on, he could become wealthy. And that is how he's portrayed, having his own house and servants and so forth. But in the story, Levi is sitting there at his table collecting their tribute, and Jesus approaches him and invites him to stop what he's doing and instead follow a different path. Remember him doing that with the fishermen? And so Levi says, oh, well, let me explore this, and invites Jesus and his followers to dinner. And it's at dinner that Jesus proclaims himself as a doctor of sinology, curing the ill effects of evil and even preventing spiritual disease. When Jesus sits at Levi's table, he's not condoning evil. He is practicing his trade of spiritual medicine, of healing people. Do we tell a medical doctor he's being a bad person when he's being with sick people? No. But you understand that this, at the time, was a radically different view of how good people, of how righteous people were supposed to act. So here, as in so many places in the Christian scriptures, we're confronted with civil and political outrage. On this literal level, we are indeed encouraged to seek justice. That's a good reaction that we have to what Jesus is doing. However, as Jesus shows us, it's not sufficient for the healing of the world or our own healing. If it were, Jesus would have done it. We'd all been healed and the world would have been good, right? Jesus was here to cure spiritual diseases and to set up the context in which all spiritual illness could be healed. And so he reaches out to us through the pages of these stories, showing us the way of transformation of our hearts and minds to cure us of our spiritual disease, our separation from the Creator, from the source. What I take from Jesus and from the interpretations of people like Swedenborg and others is that the healing of our spirit is achieved by being joined with, connected to, bonded with our loving and healing God. In terms of attachment theory, it is to be fully engaged in the flow of love because there are no barriers, there's no fears, selfish desires, false notions of superiority, stories from the past, the models of behavior that we've picked up from other sick people that would block the flow of love. Because I feel safe and loved and lovable, I can receive and pass on that love freely. That is to be healed. And so Jesus is manifesting the reality that all physical ailments, all the things that are wrong in this world, all that separates us from each other and from God, have a spiritual cause. Now, I want to be careful here and not imply that if you're physically sick that you're somehow evil. It means simply that there's a power of darkness, and it infects and attacks us spiritually, mentally, and yes, even physically, when we are separated from this flow of divine love because of our woundedness, because of our mere materiality, that we are dependent on physiology rather than spirituality for our well-being, for our value. So many people take their value from what they do, right? Their productivity, when in fact our value is intrinsic. But if I rely on simply productivity to define me, then I could get sick, right? This is the message that comes from many scriptures for many eons. We see it in the Hebrew scriptures story of Genesis, the idea of the couple sinning, of breaking the bond with their creator. That concept has become confused with inherent evilness. The point is that the scripture is describing the human condition, that we begin this life not fully connected to our God and Creator, and so we ail spiritually. So we all can say to ourselves that the sins of our past, that is, the wounds of attachment that we have, the cognitive processes that are messed up, the emotional reactivity that we have, those are the sins. They can be allowed to determine our present and our future. We can let them affect us. But these sins of the past, Jesus is saying, does not affect God's creation, God's connection with us, God's flow into us, even though it does affect our experience of being connected with the source, with God, with that flow. Relationships are complicated, right? We all know this. But we strive to be in relationship with other people, and sometimes the reaction is not helpful, right? Sometimes we have a reactivity that's not helpful. A person living the model that Jesus is here giving us, the promise is, will experience in the end unconditional love with healthy boundaries. And yes, that is complicated. Jesus is saying that we get there by sitting at the supper table, being present with those evils, those wounds, those dysfunctional ways of thinking and being, and our false notions of ourselves, sitting with them, acknowledging them, and then turning. It's called repentance, seeking transformation, seeking how to change our minds and lives. And that is following this model that Jesus is offering us, rather than following our own ideas or own thoughts. It's been important to me to figure out how it is that God doesn't let the poison of critical people's thoughts and words adulterate his view of me or of the world. How do I not let the poison of other people's criticism of me infect my view of myself and the world and of other people? And that's what Jesus had to go through. And so I think what's happening here is he experienced God's love. He experienced feeling blessed when he loved others, when he was a non-judgmental, loving presence with them. We know from the story anyway that he experienced times of separation, of feeling separated from the Father, from God. It's described how he was able, when he acknowledged God's unconditional love for him, that then he felt one with the Father. He felt that bond. As he let go of the fear of death, of the fear of abandonment, the fear of being disliked and attacked, as he let go believing what is false or loving what is evil, right? What is selfish or separating him, he more and more connected with the Father, with God, until the story says he eventually became God. Every religion has its version of this process. And in psychology, it's the process that leads to integration of the different parts, right? Of transformation, of individuation. This is the experience of regeneration, of salvation, of enlightenment, of transformation. Whenever we feel that we've lost our bond with God, with the source, with life, with the flow, because we have been valuing the ideas of the world or our own notions, when we followed the world's culture, or we become dependent on the things of the world, its lusts, right? When we're caught in the grip of merely natural desires, when we become dependent on them, that creates this separation from God. That's what this message is. And the resolution, he's saying, is to develop relationships that are non-judgmental, that do not depend on some notion we have, but always includes the promise of a healthy relationship, of unconditional love with healthy boundaries. That is the cure. So the challenge I'm recognizing to be that I have to go through this process, that I recognize when I'm being selfish, when I'm being materialistic, and I recognize that that is being harmful to me and to my relationships, and I observe it as it were, gather it around the table. And then I go seeking for a change in that spiritual health. I do that by practicing what it is to love other people, to be in their presence, to be consistently thinking that there is a way for me to be loved, for me to love others unconditionally, for me to recognize my value coming from within, it is intrinsic in me, and for me to look for that value, that goodness in other people. So no longer am I needing to separate myself from other people to protect myself from them. Rather, I want to sit with them, to love them as fellow human beings. And the promise is that I will then have an experience of what it is to have secure attachment, which I will experience as a healing and a lifting of my spirit, a secure attachment with my God, with all the parts of myself, and with other people. I pray this has supported your transformative life, whatever practice you have in your life. I want to thank Solomon Keal for his music, and I want to invite you to make a contribution to this work if you wish and are able through the PayPal link. And I invite you to continue to listen to the next episode. You be well.